"You're sitting in my seat, sir," the man sneered, his voice dripping with condescension as he hovered over Marcus Kane. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply raised his eyes from the document he'd been reviewing and met the gaze of the man, now towering above him. Charles Whitmore, a name Marcus vaguely recognized from headlines about luxury real estate deals, was red-faced, his tailored suit doing little to mask his blatant disdain. "This is seat 4A, Marcus replied calmly, his tone measured but firm. "I've had it confirmed by the flight attendant," Charles scoffed, leaning closer. "Is that so? Funny how people like you always seem to end up where they don't belong." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. People like you. It wasn't subtle. It was a jab at more than just Marcus's choice of seating. But Marcus kept his expression neutral, refusing to give Charles the satisfaction of seeing any crack in his composure. "People like me," Marcus echoed softly, his voice carrying an edge that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. "Careful, Mr. Whitmore. You might not know who you're dealing with." Charles bristled at the implication, straightening himself as if trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "Look, I'm not here to argue semantics. Just move before things get unpleasant." Unpleasant, Marcus thought, suppressing a wry smile. Things were already far beyond unpleasant, for him at least. For Charles, this was likely just another day of asserting dominance over anyone he deemed inferior. Before Marcus could respond, Charles continued, his tone growing louder, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "I mean, really," Charles added, his voice carrying a mix of mockery and thinly veiled hostility. "First class isn't exactly cheap. Are you even aware what kind of clientele flies here?" Marcus arched an eyebrow, letting silence stretch between them for a moment. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "Apparently, the kind that feels entitled to other people's seats." Few passengers exchanged glances, some visibly uncomfortable, while others pulled out their phones, no doubt recording the exchange. One woman whispered to her companion, "He's right. He was here first." But Charles wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Marcus, his arrogance swelling with each passing second. "Let's cut to the chase," Charles snapped, his lips curling into a sneer. "Did someone buy your ticket for you, or did you save up all year just to sit here?" The jab stung, though Marcus refused to let it show. Instead, he leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other as if settling in for a conversation he knew would only escalate further. "Interesting assumption," Marcus said coolly. "That success has to be handed to me rather than earned." Charles laughed, a sharp, dismissive bark that echoed through the cabin. "Earned? Please, let's not pretend we're equals just because we're breathing the same recycled air." The comment drew murmurs from around them. Some passengers shifted, uneasily, clearly torn between intervening and staying silent. Others recorded openly, their cameras trained on Charles as if anticipating what he might say next. And yet, Marcus remained unfazed. If anything, Charles's escalating insults only seemed to strengthen his resolve. There was a quiet power in his stillness, a calm that contrasted sharply with Charles's growing agitation. "You know," Marcus said after a pause, his voice low but steady, "if you wanted my seat badly enough, maybe you should have arrived on time instead of making a spectacle of yourself now." Charles opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Marcus slowly began to rise from his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. Marcus stood, his height surprising even Charles, who instinctively took a step back. The tension in the cabin thickened, every eye fixed on the two men locked in a silent standoff. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was uncertainty in Charles's demeanor. His earlier bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. What had started as a petty argument over seating arrangements now felt like something much larger, something neither of them could ignore. Marcus locked eyes with Charles, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "You've made your feelings clear, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "But understand this. I don't back down when challenged unfairly." The statement carried weight, its implications lingering. In the air, around them, whispers grew louder. Someone muttered, "This is ridiculous," while another passenger chimed in, "Why doesn't he just apologize?" But Charles said nothing. His face flushed anew, whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear. As Marcus adjusted his tie, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, he allowed himself a brief glance around the cabin. The reactions varied: sympathy, curiosity, judgment, yet none of it mattered. Not really, because deep down Marcus understood that this moment wasn't just about him, it was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. With that realization burning within him, Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Charles until they were nearly chest to chest. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper but laced with authority, he said, "Now, what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Marcus Kane sat with an air of quiet authority, his tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, his leather briefcase resting at his feet like a silent testament to his success. To the untrained eye, he could have been any other passenger in first class, polished, composed, and seemingly unremarkable. But there was something about him, a subtle magnetism that drew attention without demanding it. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted his worth from the rooftops. No flashy watches or ostentatious gestures betrayed his status as the CEO of a groundbreaking renewable energy startup, revolutionizing how the world powered itself. Yet here he was, flying first class, not because he craved luxury, but because time was a currency more precious than gold. Every second counted when you were reshaping industries, and yet, beneath the calm surface, a storm brewed. The confrontation with Charles Whitmore gnawed at him, not because he doubted himself, but because moments like this reminded him of battles fought long before. Battles that had shaped him into the man standing tall now, even if no one else saw the scars they'd left behind. As Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, a habit born out of nervous energy, he couldn't help but wonder what Charles would say if he knew the truth, not just about the seat Marcus occupied, but about the life he'd built, despite every obstacle placed in his path. To understand Marcus Kane, you had to go back to the cramped apartment where he grew up, the walls thin enough, to hear neighbors arguing late into the night. His mother worked tirelessly, juggling 3 jobs to keep food on the table and send him to private school. She believed education was the key to breaking free from the cycle of poverty that gripped their community. But the road wasn't easy. At school, Marcus quickly learned he didn't belong, not because of his intellect, which far surpassed many of his peers, but because of the color of his skin. He endured taunts about his thrift store clothes, his different accent, and the assumption that someone like him shouldn't be there. Boys snickered when he raised his hand in class. Teachers overlooked him, assuming he wouldn't contribute. Yet, through it all, Marcus found strength. Each insult fueled his determination to prove them wrong, not just for himself, but for his mother, whose sacrifices deserved better. Nights spent studying under flickering lamplight turned into scholarships, internships, and eventually opportunities others thought impossible for someone like him. It wasn't just resilience, it was defiance, a refusal to let society's low expectations dictate his future. Those early years taught him how to navigate spaces where he wasn't welcome, how to rise above prejudice without letting bitterness consume him. And though decades separated him from that boy sitting alone in the cafeteria, the memories lingered, shaping the man who now faced down arrogance with unwavering poise. Success hadn't erased the sting of bias, it had merely transformed it. Even now, as a billionaire and industry leader, Marcus faced moments that felt like echoes of his childhood. Waitstaff assumed he couldn't afford fine dining. Colleagues dismissed his ideas until someone white repeated them verbatim. Strangers congratulated him on being articulate, as if eloquence were unexpected. These microaggressions weren't always overt, but they chipped away at him nonetheless. They reminded him that no amount of wealth or influence could shield him from systemic racism, the kind woven so deeply into society that most people didn't even notice it. Moments like the one unfolding on the plane mattered precisely because they forced him to confront those lingering doubts head-on. Was he angry? Yes, but not for himself. For every young black child told they didn't belong, every professional underestimated because of their name or appearance. As Marcus stood facing Charles, he felt the weight of all those invisible battles pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about proving that he, and countless others like him, deserved respect, regardless of preconceived notions. The confrontation loomed ahead, its outcome uncertain. But the thing was clear: Marcus Kane wasn't backing down. Charles Whitmore strode down the aisle like he owned the plane, his polished leather shoes clicking against the floor with an almost theatrical precision. He was late, of course he was, and yet it seemed as though everyone else's inconvenience was simply collateral damage in his grand entrance. "Excuse me," he barked at a flight attendant who dared to step into his path, his tone dripping with impatience. "Can we speed this up? Some of us have places to be." His gaze swept across the cabin, lingering just a fraction too long on Marcus before he settled into what he assumed was his seat, at least until reality set in. Narrowing his eyes, Charles turned back toward Marcus, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're in my seat," he declared, his voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of pre-flight chatter. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as Charles's demeanor shifted from irritation to outright hostility. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was clear that Charles saw Marcus as an intrusion, someone who didn't fit the image of first-class privilege he'd constructed in his mind. And so, with every passing second, the tension between them grew thicker, heavier, until it felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath. Charles wasn't done. Oh no, far from it. As the initial accusation hung in the air, he leaned closer, his posture radiating condescension. "Funny," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I didn't think they taught finance in community college." The jab landed, with calculated precision, designed not just to insult but to undermine, to plant seeds of doubt about Marcus's right to occupy such a prestigious space. But Marcus remained unfazed, his expression betraying nothing more than mild curiosity. "I assure you," Marcus replied coolly, "my education is quite sufficient for managing my affairs, and yours, apparently." A ripple of murmurs spread among the passengers. Some chuckled nervously, others exchanged uneasy glances. One man whispered to his companion, "That guy's out of line," while another woman shook her head, muttering under her breath, "This is ridiculous." But Charles pressed on, emboldened by his own sense of superiority. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "First class isn't exactly the place for charity cases." The word stung, though Marcus refused to let it show. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Charles with an intensity that made the other man shift uncomfortably. "You seem awfully invested in where I belong," Marcus observed, his tone deceptively light. "Careful, Mr. Whitmore. That kind of fixation says more about you than it does about me." For a moment Charles faltered, caught off guard by the quiet authority in Marcus's voice. But then his face hardened, his ego demanding retaliation. "Well, maybe if you'd paid attention to your boarding pass instead of trying to impress people." "Impress people?" Marcus interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you think this is about?" Before Charles could answer, a flight attendant approached cautiously, attempting to mediate. "Gentlemen, is everything all right here?" Neither responded immediately. The tension crackled like static electricity, drawing all eyes toward the unfolding drama. It didn't escape Marcus's notice how quickly the flight attendant sprang into action once Charles raised his voice. A glass of champagne appeared in his hand within seconds, accompanied by fawning apologies for any misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Marcus's earlier request for water had gone unanswered, relegated to the background amidst the commotion. He watched silently as one attendant hovered near Charles, nodding excessively as the man vented his frustrations. Another shot Marcus an apologetic glance, but did little else to address the imbalance. The favoritism was subtle, yet unmistakable, a microcosm of the systemic bias Marcus navigated daily. It wasn't personal, it rarely was, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. Still, Marcus kept his composure, even as Charles continued to dominate the conversation. There would be time enough to address these injustices later. For now, he focused on the bigger picture, exposing the audacity of men like Charles, who believed they were untouchable. As the altercation dragged on, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what Charles would do when he realized just how wrong he truly was. Charles's voice rose above the hum of the cabin, cutting through any semblance of civility that might have remained. "You don't belong here," he bellowed, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus, as though trying to will him out of existence. "This isn't your world. Go back where you came from." The words hit like a punch, raw and unfiltered, leaving no room for ambiguity about the racism driving his tirade. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some averting their eyes while others stared openly, phones poised to capture every second. Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, meeting Charles's rage with a calm that only seemed to infuriate the man further. "Where exactly is it you think I should go?" Marcus asked quietly, his tone razor-sharp despite its softness. Charles sputtered, caught off guard by the question but unwilling to back down. "I'm just saying. This seat, this flight, it's not meant for people who can't afford it. Stop pretending otherwise." The insult landed with calculated cruelty, designed to strip away whatever dignity Marcus might still hold on to. But instead of shrinking under the weight of Charles's words, Marcus leaned forward ever so slightly, his expression unreadable yet undeniably powerful. "You're operating on assumptions," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced even the murmurs around them. "And assumptions have a way of crumbling when faced with facts." Charles bristled, his face reddening as he struggled to regain control of the narrative. "Facts? What facts? You're sitting in my seat. That's all anyone needs to know." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He had already begun plotting his next move, his mind racing ahead even as Charles continued to rant. The confrontation was far from over. It was only beginning. Around them, the cabin buzzed with reactions. One woman whispered urgently to her seatmate, "He was here first. I saw him board." Another passenger chimed in, shaking his head, "This guy's out of control." Some recorded the scene discreetly, their phone cameras trained on Charles, as he ranted, oblivious to how his behavior was being immortalized online. Others avoided looking altogether, burying themselves in books or headphones, desperate to escape the discomfort of witnessing such blatant prejudice. A few brave souls attempted to intervene. An older man seated nearby leaned forward, addressing Charles directly. "Sir, maybe you should take a breath. This isn't helping anyone." But Charles waved him off dismissively. "Stay out of this, unless you want to end up like him," he snapped, jabbing a thumb in Marcus's direction. The remark drew gasps from several passengers, cementing Charles's image as the villain of the moment. Yet for all the murmurs of disapproval, no one stepped forward to challenge him outright. Marcus noticed it all. The whispers, the recordings, the silent judgment. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the lesson this moment could teach, not just to Charles, but to everyone watching. As Charles doubled down, calling Marcus names and questioning his very presence aboard the flight, Marcus let the insults wash over him. They were nothing new. He'd heard them before in different forms. But this time, he wouldn't let them linger unanswered. Charles's frustration boiled over into outright venom. "What are you even doing here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did someone pity you for buying this ticket? Or did you save up all year just to pretend you're something you're not?" Each word was a calculated strike, meant to wound and humiliate. Yet Marcus absorbed them without flinching, his composure unshaken, even as Charles circled closer, invading his personal space. "Let me make something clear," Charles continued, his tone laced with mockery. "People like you don't belong in places like this. You're wasting resources better spent on people who actually deserve them." The audacity of the statement struck a chord, not just with Marcus, but with those watching. Several passengers exchanged horrified glances, while others whispered heatedly among themselves. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Charles with an intensity that made the other man falter momentarily. "People like me?" he echoed softly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Do yourself a favor, Mr. Whitmore. Think carefully about what you're implying before you dig yourself deeper." Charles scoffed, brushing off the warning. "Oh, come on. Don't act like you don't know what I mean. We both know you don't have the credentials or the bank account to justify being here." It was a low blow, one designed to provoke doubt and shame. But Marcus simply smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of his lips that sent a shiver down Charles's spine. "You'd be surprised," Marcus replied, his tone almost conversational. "How wrong assumptions can lead to consequences no one sees." "Coming!" The cryptic response unnerved Charles, who opened his mouth to retort but hesitated, sensing for the first time that he might be in over his head. The flight attendants hovered anxiously nearby, torn between diffusing the situation and avoiding Charles's wrath. One approached Marcus cautiously, offering a hesitant smile. "Sir, is there anything we can do to assist you?" Her attempt at mediation felt hollow, overshadowed by the obvious deference shown to Charles throughout the altercation. Marcus nodded politely, masking his irritation. "Thank you, but I believe this matter will resolve itself shortly." Meanwhile, another attendant leaned toward Charles, whispering assurances that corporate would be notified if necessary. The promise seemed to embolden him further. "Good," Charles snapped. "They need to hear about this. Maybe then they'll understand why standards matter." His arrogance grated against the growing tension in the cabin, where passengers were increasingly siding with Marcus. Even the crew exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading, yet none dared to challenge Charles directly, not until it became clear which side held the real power. And Marcus, standing tall amidst the chaos, knew precisely how to tip the scales. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, his tone measured but firm, "you've made your position abundantly clear, but allow me to return the favor. You have no idea who I am." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time since the confrontation began, Charles faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Marcus locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable yet undeniably commanding. Whatever doubts Charles harbored now simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to unravel his sense of superiority. As the plane soared onward, the stage was set for a reckoning, one that would redefine not just this flight, but the lives of everyone involved. Just as the tension reached its peak, a nervous flight attendant approached Marcus with a folded note in hand. "Sir?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cabin. "The captain wanted me to give you this." Marcus accepted the note with a nod, unfolding it to reveal a simple message. "Is everything all right? Let us know how we can assist." It wasn't much, but it was enough. A subtle acknowledgement that someone in authority recognized the injustice unfolding. For Marcus, it was all he needed. He glanced up at the attendant and replied calmly, "Thank you, I'll be making a call shortly." His tone carried an unspoken promise, one that sent a ripple of unease through Charles, who had been watching the exchange closely. "What are you going to do?" Charles demanded, his earlier bravado wavering. "You think some little note is going to change anything?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slipped the note into his pocket and turned his attention back to Charles, his expression unreadable, yet undeniably commanding. The game was about to change, and Charles had no idea what was coming. Marcus reached for his phone, dialing a number from memory. As the line connected, he addressed Charles directly, his voice steady and deliberate. "Before we proceed further, Mr. Whitmore, allow me to clarify something. You seem under the impression that I'm just another passenger fighting over seating arrangements. Allow me to correct that misconception." Charles frowned, clearly confused, but unwilling to show it. "What are you talking about?" "I own a significant stake in this airline," Marcus stated matter-of-factly, letting the words sink in. "Which means your behavior today isn't just rude, it's grounds for immediate removal from this flight." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Passengers gasped audibly while others exchanged astonished glances. Even the flight attendants froze mid-step, their earlier deference to Charles now replaced by wide-eyed respect for Marcus. Charles's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You're bluffing," he stammered, though his trembling voice betrayed his doubt. "Am I?" Marcus countered smoothly. "Would you like me to confirm it with corporate right now? Or perhaps you'd prefer to explain yourself to them personally?" The threat hung heavy in the air, silencing any rebuttal Charles might have attempted. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely afraid, not of Marcus, but of the power he represented. Charles's panic was palpable, his earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of reality. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he fumbled for words, his mind racing to salvage what little dignity remained. "Wait," he blurted out, his voice tinged with desperation. "Let's not jump to conclusions here. Surely there's a way to resolve this without involving whoever you're calling." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression inscrutable. "Oh, I assure you, they'll want to hear about this. In fact, I suspect your reputation will precede you once word gets out." The implication sent a visible shiver through Charles, who suddenly seemed smaller, less imposing. Gone was the entitled businessman. In his place stood a man desperate to avoid accountability. Passengers watched intently, some whispering among themselves about the dramatic reversal of fortune. One woman muttered, "Serves him right," while another nodded in agreement. Even the flight crew distanced themselves subtly, their earlier eagerness to appease Charles evaporating completely. They now hovered closer to Marcus, their body language conveying newfound deference. "You don't understand," Charles pleaded, his voice cracking under the strain. "I didn't mean what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone cutting through Charles's rambling. "To insult me, to question my presence here, to treat me as though I'm invisible?" Each question landed like a hammer blow, leaving Charles reeling. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words, only the bitter taste of defeat. As the confrontation unfolded, fragments of Marcus's past surfaced in sharp relief. Memories of late-night meetings, strategic investments, and calculated risks flashed before his mind, a testament to the vision driving his success. He hadn't acquired stakes in industries dominated by systemic racism merely for profit. He'd done so to dismantle barriers, From diversifying leadership teams within airlines to funding scholarships for underrepresented students, every decision was purposeful, aimed at creating opportunities where none existed. This moment aboard the plane wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It was proof that wealth wielded responsibly could challenge prejudice and inspire change. Charles, oblivious to these motivations, continued to squirm under Marcus's gaze. "Look, maybe we can work this out," he offered weakly, grasping at straws. But Marcus wasn't interested in negotiations. "Your actions speak louder than your apologies," he said firmly, "and trust me, people are listening." Indeed, the passengers recording the altercation were already uploading videos online, hashtags like "There's Justice for Marcus" trending across platforms. The world was watching and judging. With quiet authority, Marcus rose to his full height, his presence commanding the room. "Here's what's going to happen," he declared, addressing both Charles and the captivated audience around them. "You will apologize, not to me, but to everyone who has ever been made to feel lesser because of ignorance, like yours." Charles stammered, his protests dying on his lips as Marcus fixed him with a steely glare. And then, Marcus added, his tone softening slightly, "You'll reflect on why moments like this matter, because until attitudes change, real progress remains impossible." The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Charles, once domineering, now sat defeated, his facade shattered. Meanwhile, Marcus exuded strength, not for revenge, but for justice. As the plane descended toward its destination, the stage was set for resolution, but the impact would resonate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The moment the plane touched down, airport security arrived at the gate, their presence commanding immediate attention. Passengers craned their necks as two uniformed officers approached Charles, who visibly paled at the sight of them. "Mr. Whitmore?" one officer asked, his tone formal but firm. "We've been informed of an incident aboard this flight. Please, come with us." Charles shot a panicked glance at Marcus, his eyes pleading for mercy that never came. Instead, Marcus stood calmly by his seat, watching silently as Charles was escorted out of the cabin. The walk of shame was slow and humiliating, every step punctuated by the stares of passengers who had witnessed his unraveling. Some clapped softly under their breath. Others whispered condemnations loud enough for him to hear. One elderly woman muttered "good riddance," while a young man shook his head muttering "serves him right." For Charles, it was a stark fall from grace. His earlier arrogance had dissolved into sheer mortification, leaving him trembling as he disappeared through the jet bridge. Marcus didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his tie, a small gesture of closure, and turned to gather his belongings. But even as he prepared to disembark, he knew this wasn't the end. The ripple effects of what had transpired were only beginning to spread. Within hours, footage of the confrontation flooded social media platforms, sparking outrage and admiration in equal measure. Clips capturing Charles's tirade went viral, accompanied by hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "Judge Accountability in Action." Comments poured in from around the globe. Some praised Marcus's composure and quiet strength, calling him a role model for marginalized communities. Others condemned Charles's behavior, labeling him everything from entitled to outright racist. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a modern-day reckoning against systemic bias. Headlines blared phrases like "billionaire CEO takes down racist passenger" and "a lesson in privilege gone wrong." But beyond the sensationalism lay deeper conversations about race, privilege, and accountability. Viewers shared personal stories of discrimination they'd faced in similar settings, on planes, in offices, or elsewhere, highlighting how pervasive such injustices remained. Marcus scrolled through some of the coverage on his phone, pausing occasionally to read comments. While gratified by the support, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. These incidents shouldn't be celebrated as victories. They should serve as reminders of work still left undone. As he closed his laptop, Marcus resolved to channel the momentum into something meaningful. This wasn't just about exposing Charles's prejudice, it was about inspiring change on a larger scale. Later that evening, Marcus sat down with a prominent journalist for an exclusive interview. Cameras rolled as he leaned forward, speaking with clarity and conviction. "This isn't about revenge," he began, addressing not just the reporter, but everyone tuning in. "It's about exposing the everyday injustices people of color face so we can create lasting change." He recounted not only the events aboard the flight, but also the broader context behind them, the microaggressions, the dismissive attitudes, and the systemic barriers that persisted despite progress. "I could have ignored it," Marcus admitted. "Many do. But silence doesn't dismantle prejudice, it perpetuates it. Moments like these remind us why visibility matters, why representation matters, and why standing up, even when it's uncomfortable, is essential." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with viewers worldwide. Social media lit up again, this time with calls to action. Organizations reached out, eager to collaborate on initiatives promoting diversity and inclusion. Marcus ended the interview with a statement that would become a rallying cry. "I didn't become successful to prove I'm better than anyone else. I did it to show that we all deserve a seat at the table." The sentiment reverberated far beyond the confines of the interview, galvanizing individuals and institutions alike to take meaningful steps toward equity. While Marcus emerged stronger, Charles faced devastating consequences. Sponsors severed ties almost immediately, citing irreparable damage to his public image. High-profile clients distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone labeled a bigot. Articles dissecting his downfall dominated headlines. "Real estate mogul loses empire after racist meltdown," and "How one flight cost Charles Whitmore everything." His attempts at damage control fell flat. A hastily released apology video, where he stumbled over rehearsed lines, only fueled further ridicule online. Critics dismissed it as insincere, pointing out its lack of accountability or genuine remorse. Professionally, Charles's empire crumbled. Projects stalled, deals collapsed, and whispers of lawsuits swirled. Colleagues avoided him entirely, fearful of being tainted by association. But perhaps the most painful blow came from within his own circles. Friends turned, acquaintances ghosted him. Family members distanced themselves publicly, embarrassed by his actions. In mere days, Charles went from untouchable mogul to pariah, a cautionary tale of unchecked privilege and hubris. And yet, for all the chaos he endured, there was no redemption arc in sight. Inspired by the global response to the incident, Marcus launched an initiative aimed at increasing diversity in leadership roles across industries, not just aviation, dubbed Seats at the Table. The campaign focused on dismantling systemic barriers, advocating for inclusive hiring practices and empowering underrepresented voices. Within weeks, it garnered widespread support, attracting partners ranging from Fortune 500 companies to grassroots organizations. For Marcus, it was more than a professional endeavor. It was personal. Each partnership, each success story, reinforced his belief that change was possible if people committed to it. As he addressed a packed auditorium during the campaign's launch event, Marcus concluded with a message that echoed his earlier interview. "This movement isn't about exclusion, it's about inclusion. Together, we can build a world where everyone has a fair chance to succeed." The applause was thunderous, signaling not just approval, but hope. Hope that moments like the one aboard that flight could inspire transformation, not division. As the story concludes, take a moment to reflect. What would you have done if you were in Marcus's shoes? Would you have stood your ground or walked away? These moments of injustice happen every day, often unseen, but they don't have to go unchallenged. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going and shine a light on the experiences that shape our world. Your voice matters. Use it. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. It tells us we're not alone in striving for justice. Subscribe for more empowering content that challenges stereotypes and inspires change. And don't stop there. Share this video with friends, family, and colleagues. Every view brings awareness closer to action. Together, we can turn these stories into movements that drive real progress. Change starts with courage, the courage to speak up, to act, and to believe in a better future. Together, we can challenge injustice and build a world where everyone has a fair chance to succeed. Thank you for watching, listening, and being part of the solution. Until next time, rise, resist, and reimagine.